and welcome to the Books on Asia podcast, sponsored by Stonebridge Press, publisher of fine books on Asia for over 30 years, located at www.stonebridge.com. And I'm your host, Amy Chavez. Today I'm talking with a Yokohama-based author, Burritt Sabin. Sabin was born in New York City and came to Japan as a naval officer in 1975. His professional career in Japan started as a journalist, and he quickly moved into writing and historical research. The first book we're going to talk about today is about Yokohama, a city known for being one of the first Japanese ports to open to foreign trade in the 1850s. A historical guide to Yokohama, Sketches of the Twice-Risen Phoenix, is a window into a time when Japan was rapidly opening up to the world. The other book we'll talk about is Kamakura, a contemplative guide. This book highlights the first samurai capital in the 12th century that Shogun Minamoto no Yoritomo chose for the seat of his military government, which ushered in the Kamakura period in 1185. So, welcome, Burritt.
Hi, Amy. Thanks for inviting me today.
Sure. I just finished your book, A Historical Guide to Yokohama, and it is so well written.
Oh, well, thank you very much.
So I was wondering if we could start with the Hotel New Grand. And that is a story that concerns MacArthur. You have a photo in the book of the lobby of the hotel, which is really rather fascinating. And you also talk about the writer Osaragi Jiro, as well as some others.
That's correct. That's correct. Well, the Hotel New Grand, the story of the hotel, its origins, are fascinating. It arises from the 1923 earthquake, which devastated Yokohama. And so in the succeeding years, business leaders got together. They said, well, what should we do to revive the city? One of their first actions was to build a large hotel. And that may seem like an odd thing to do after an earthquake. The reason was that Yokohama was actually called the Silk Port. When the earthquake struck, all the foreign merchants involved in the silk trade all began to go to Kobe, which they had the infrastructure for trade. So the city fathers wanted to, stem the hemorrhaging of foreign businessmen. So they built, the Hotel New Grand as a place for them to stay. As well, it's interesting because they employed rather than a foreign architect, a Japanese architect by the name of Watanabe Jin, who, designed it. He realized the history of Yokohama. He realized it was a portal for the entrance of, Western things. So he wanted something that was Western, but also something that was also Japanese. So it's this marvelous blend of East and West, which I think in the photograph in the book even shows that. We see the Tempio, Buddhist celestial nymphs. Over in the transom above elevator doors, Art Deco flourishes. There is the Phoenix Room, which is another marvelous room. And there's also the Rainbow Ballroom, which, as its name suggests, actually has illumination of bands of light along the ceiling and the colors of the rainbow, which is actually a ballroom. That's also another marvelous room. And on top of that, you have all, these interesting people that stayed there. People like Charlie Chaplin stayed there. Babe Ruth, when the U.S. All-Stars traveled around Japan, Douglas Fairbanks stayed there. Osaragi, which you mentioned, actually made that his workroom. And there's still a room there called the Kuruma Room, I believe. Basically, in that room was where he wrote a series of best-selling novels. And I mentioned MacArthur. MacArthur, he went there on his honeymoon, I believe in 1937, with his wife Jean, returned later after the war, directly after the war was over. And actually, that was his first headquarters. There was the Hotel New Grand. He was only there a very short time, but he did very significant things there. And there's actually a MacArthur suite, which you can stay in. It's phenomenally expensive, like I think 400,000 yen per night. But you can sit at I've done this. I haven't stayed there. Excuse me. I was invited to see the inside of the room. And I sat at the desk where he penned some of the important initiatives for the occupation. That desk is still there. Very, very historic. So for all those reasons, the Hotel New Grand is, from a historical perspective and the architectural perspective, is a fascinating place. And it's still, anyone is welcome to go in at any time. You can walk through the lobby. In the bottom, they even have a little gallery of photographs talking about some of the things I just mentioned.
You mentioned Osaragi Jiro, who was obviously a very prominent Japanese author. Does he have any books that have been translated into English?
Yes, there are. Let me see. One is the original Japanese title is Kikyo, which is translated as Homecoming. And there's another one called The Journey. Japanese title is Tabi. Homecoming, Kikyo, I highly recommend. That's a very, very good book. Osaragi himself spent time. He was sent by the Japanese government of Southeast Asia during the war to Singapore, etc. I've seen photographs of him in Yogyakarta at the big Buddhist monument there. The idea was they were going to write and kind of propagandize the war effort. But he knew it, he saw it for what it was. And his book is very, very, anti-war and really dissects the psychology of the Japanese after the war. And the book is not well known. It's not well known, Kikyo or the Homecoming. Plus, it has a lot in there. Yokohama figures, as does Kamakura.
Then, of course, Yokohama, I believe, was the first port to open to foreigners. Then Townsend Harris was the first U.S. consulate. And I thought it was really interesting where you said that Townsend Harris met Commodore Perry in Shanghai.
That's correct. Basically, it was a job interview. Townsend Harris went to Shanghai to meet Perry and ask him if he would take him up as part of the mission to Japan. And Perry refused. Not because he wasn't impressed by Harris, but because his philosophy was he'd only take on his ships people who were absolutely essential to his mission.
And then when Harris went ahead then and applied for the consulate position, that's when Perry helped him secure that, right?
Perry was a reference, as we say today. He was a reference. Perry came 53, 54. When Harris met him in Shanghai, it was between visits to Japan. He brought the letter from, I think, President Fillmore to the Japanese government, then said, I'll be back for a reply next year. Then he went to the China coast. That's when he met Harris. Then he returned later to get a reply. So the treaty then that Perry got was called the Treaty of Amity, or the Kanagawa Treaty for short, opened up Shimoda and Hakodate to American representatives. And that's what led to, Harris later going to, I think it was 56. That treaty had to be ratified, and they had to find someone to fill a position. All these, bureaucratic decisions take time.
I really enjoyed your story about how the Japanese at Shimoda decided to show the Americans sumo.
Actually, that was in Yokohama.
That was Yokohama. Okay.
On one side, you had the Americans were trying to show their superiority through the technology. If they brought a telegraph equipment, they brought a small locomotive, which I don't know if you have children, but maybe you've gone to in Japan, a department store or some little fair where they'll have set up, a small little railroad where children can get on and go around in a circle. It was that sort of thing. All these Japanese officials all wanted to ride on it. These are toy locomotives. These are, like I described, what children would get on. So they have all these, Japanese men in with their kimono flapping in the wind, riding around on this railway with big smiles on their faces. So, and a telegraph that could transmit messages at a distance of a mile also was mind-boggling, the technology. So they tried to, my own opinion is they tried to show, well, you have that, but we are strong. And they had, sumo wrestlers come out, and Perry was not impressed. He thought this was, this demonstration of brute force was, actually unseemly. But then the curious thing is too, some of the Marines, I think, tried to wrestle the sumo wrestlers, and they were quite quickly, dispatched onto their backs.
So at first, Commodore Perry, he negotiated the Treaty of Amity, and then he didn't push for any trading at that point, right? So Harris, he's the one who then opened up the ports. Is that for trade? Is that correct?
That's right. He sought a commercial treaty with Japan. So Harris wanted open, commercial ports, and also, things like tariff regulations, and also the right for Americans to reside in Japan. So in that regard, yes, he opened up 5 ports, one of which was Kanagawa, which is of significance, to our story here.
I'd like to move on to your next book. This is your most recent, and it's called Kamakura, A Contemplative Guide. It's another type of guidebook. Can you tell us what you were trying to convey with the subtitle, A Contemplative Guide?
By contemplative guide, In other words, it goes deep. You've read the book. It's not a light read. Actually, it goes into depth about religion, architecture, and what do those things mean? That is the idea of the contemplation, an in-depth look, the significance of things.
Okay, for example, the Kamakura Buddha, right?
Yes, which is probably the most well-known site. The great Buddha Kotokuin is the icon of Kamakura. I mean, there are many, many. Actually, there are only two daibutsu. One is at Todaiji and the other is at Kotokuin. Of course, the one in Todaiji is housed in, the Buddha, the hall, in contrast to the great Buddha, the daibutsu of Kamakura, which is outdoors, because the hall was, washed away in presumably either a heavy storm or a tsunami many hundreds of years ago. It's also the only statue in Kamakura that's designated a national treasure. But to me, the fact that it's outdoors and that its visage, its aspect changes throughout the day and throughout the seasons is what I find, is its greatest charm.
Yeah, and there, according to your book, there's also a poem by Yosano Akiko, the feminist poet.
That's right. She made a mistake in describing Amida Buddha as the Buddha, which is an interesting story. And then that caused her a lot of grief. When an error was pointed out to her, she was embarrassed, and she wrote another poem. But she talked to her poet friends, and they said, "Well, the original poem is it's a masterpiece. Don't change it. Poems are not the stuff of scholarship. Don't worry about that." And so it remains, Shakyamuni, it says,
right,
rather than Amida Buddha. And it's curious too, just an aside, that the Kawabata Yasunari, for whatever reason, he points that out in one of his novels.
So I didn't realize that Natsume Soseki and D.T. Suzuki had met.
Right. To me, that's remarkable. Soseki, I believe it was 1895. For all his genius, he had a lot of emotional challenges. He thought that staying at his Zen temple, it would maybe give him, some sort of peace of mind. So he stayed at a sub-temple of Enkakuji, which is called Kigen Inn. And in December of 1895, he was studying under a man named Shaku Soen. He was the abbot, very distinguished Zen priest, who actually, even, for example, this man had intercourse with people like Tolstoy. So he was a very internationally well-known scholar. So Soseki was studying under him, and he went and stayed at this little sub-temple. And there was another layperson there, like him, studying. They were about the same age, early 20s. Over a decade later, that Soseki, described the experience in his novel Mon, or The Gate. And they never met again. Soseki, I believe he died in 1916, rather young. Suzuki, on the other hand, went on, he lived a long life. He lived into his 90s. And he did occasionally comment on, I think he called him Soseki-kun, talking about that meeting, but they never met again. My own speculation is it's unfortunate, because if they'd kept up a relationship, Suzuki, who actually achieved enlightenment, would have been perhaps someone who could have helped Soseki. Well, he's a national novelist, meaning he is someone that is taught in schools, someone that any Japanese knows, someone that graced, up until recently, I believe it was the 5,000 bills. Suzuki, on the other hand, was another man of great accomplishments, a linguist, a scholar, a very, very good writer, who, rightly is credited with proselytizing, Zen abroad, lived many years in the United States, influenced many, many Americans, the Beat Generation, John Cage, Gary Snyder, et cetera, et cetera. And the fact that these two both, went on to achieve, great things in their fields, were together by accident for 2 weeks, at the end of 1895, at that small temple, to me, is infinitely fascinating.
Right.
And I said, and Soseki described that in the novel Mon. He describes Suzuki as, he looked like an arhat. An arhat is a kind of a Buddhist saint. Yeah. It's very funny. He also describes how, I don't know if it's true, but he says that Suzuki, or the character of Suzuki, would used to go out in town, and they used to have, would have Buddhist masses for people who had, for funerals and et cetera. and he'd give out food. So the priest would go out and get food, and Suzuki would pretend to be a priest, and you go out and get all this free food out in town. I thought that was rather, it's funny. It's even a little funny note in the novel, which is, anyway, I think it's a fascinating story. It's not well known, though. In April and December, there was a gathering at Kigen-in celebrating Soseki. Not Suzuki so much as Soseki. And it's called the Soseki no Kai. There's even a little placard that mentions Soseki no Kai. But I don't know if it's still continuing. Corona, ended a lot of things. And I know during Corona, they stopped.
Yeah, he's still so popular among the Japanese. Now, D.T. Suzuki's grave is in Kamakura, isn't it?
That's correct. That's at Tokeiji. And I've visited a number of times. I was there 2 years ago, and there was a Malaysian of Chinese descent with his family. And I just got they speak in English. I got to fell into conversation. He says looking for Suzuki's grave. So I guided him there, and I was curious, why, the evidence Suzuki asked, he went on explaining what a great man Suzuki was. Let's say a Malaysian, of Chinese descent, living in Kuala Lumpur, describing to me what a great man Suzuki was. And he said to me, well, you want to know why there's no museum here, why there isn't anything here. There's a museum of Suzuki that's over in his Kanazawa, where he grew up. But actually, in a sense, there is a museum next to Tokeiji, is the Matsuoka Bunko, which is Suzuki's library. In a sense, that is a shrine, or it is a memorial to Suzuki. That library is open only to people who have a very, very, are studying Zen and have real, scholars.
Okay,
people have,
right.
Really strong. It's not open to the average person, but it's an extensive building, and it's there. So in a sense, that is a monument to Suzuki. But yeah, Suzuki's grave is not big. It's unassuming, which you'd expect. You wouldn't expect something elaborate from a Zen scholar. And next to that is the grave of R.H. Blythe, who was a good friend of his, an Englishman who made a contribution in introducing haiku to English-speaking audiences. So he's buried next to him, R.H. Blythe.
Lastly, I want to speak briefly, because we're running out of time, about the Kamakura Bunshi. Now, Bunshi, I guess, would be like the literati, but it refers to a specific group of writers in Kamakura around the same period. So could you tell us a little bit about them?
The Kamakura Bunshi basically are a group of writers, a coterie of writers that kind of formed probably from the early 1930s through like the 1950s. But they're a group of people who basically gravitated to Kamakura for a variety of reasons. Well, one was the climate, one was the history. When one of them got down there, it attracted others. For example, Octopus Rinosuke lived in Kamakura for about a year. And then Kume Masao and Octagawa both studied in the Soseki. Kume began to visit Octagawa, and he got interested in Kamakura, and he moved down there. So there are a lot of people that were there, writers that were there, inviting their writer friends to come down. Osuragi Jiro actually got to Kamakura about 1926. Kawabata, in the 1930s. Kobayashi Hideo, the great critic. The Kami Jun, another novelist. But they formed this coterie down there. But the curious thing about them is they weren't really a school. They didn't share a philosophy. They were from all different schools of literature. For example, Osuragi, though he wrote 2 books that could be considered serious literature, most of his writing was either historical or, somewhat, kind of adventure stories for children. Whereas Kawabata was, a sensualist. Kobayashi Hideo was an essayist, criticizing the literary establishments. They all had different, theories of literature, but they all came together in kind of their love for the city. And what bound them together was basically civic activities. For example, creating the Kamakura Carnival or the Kamakura Pen Club.
Yeah, that was a great idea, wasn't it?
Yes. Unfortunately, for a number of reasons, it stopped. That they created a Kamakura. It was a beauty contest they created in the 40s. Kawabata, etc. They all were judges. Kume Masao were judges for this contest. And they created a Bon Dori festival, which is this festival of lights, that still survives. It's held every year at Hachimangu. And also, they wrote a lot about Kamakura also. Kawabata, I mentioned the 2 books earlier, 1,000 Cranes and Sound of the Mountain, are both 2 novels set in Kamakura. A lot of Kikyo, or The Homecoming by Osaragi, is also set in Kamakura. Satomi Ton set a number of works in Kamakura. He was the best friend of Ozu Yasujiro, the film director, who's also considered one of, he wasn't a writer, but part of this, the Kamakura Bunshi.
So, are you working on any new books right now, Burritt?
Yes, I am, Amy. I am writing a travel book about Tsushima, which is the island, midway between Korea and Japan.
Wow, that's a very historical spot.
Yeah, a lot of history, both with Japan and Russia, and Japan and Korea. Also, a lot of natural beauty, own unique cuisine. So it's a fascinating place.
Is it going to be a guidebook?
No. It'll be a travel book.
Yeah, a first-person account of going and seeing things?
Yeah, right.
When do you think that will be released?
Hopefully early next year.
Well, do let me know when it comes out, and maybe we can have you back on the podcast. Lastly, I just wanted you to briefly let us know what your 3 favorite books on Japan are, or 3 great books on Japan that you would recommend with a sentence about each one.
Turning to Yokohama, there will be a book called The Death of Old Yokohama and the Earthquake of 1923, a book written by a man named Otis Manchester Poole, who was in Yokohama. He was a merchant American. He was here when the earthquake struck. What he did was he took notes, copious notes, after the earthquake struck. And it's his journey from his office, which is near Chinatown, trying to get to the bluff to see that his family was okay. And it is harrowing. He's describing things as they are happening and jotting down notes, talking about, packs of feral dogs, talking about firestorms, riots against Koreans, and some bravery. There's a little bit of even humor in this book, but it's not a book that's well known. And 2 other books are both in Japanese. One is called Aru Shisei no To, Koshikata Kanashiku Mono, which translates something like A Waif of the City. The passage was one of sorrow. The story of a man named Hasegawa Shin, born in Yokohama probably in the 1870s, into poverty. His mother left him at age 4, no chance for an education. And he worked as a child. He worked as a little tobacconist, selling pipe tobacco. Worked in the docks, but taught himself to read and write. And he went on to become one of Japan's most popular playwrights. There were a lot of stories about yakuza, etc., and heroes and all this sort of thing. But very, very popular place, which a number of them were made into movies. Once again, Aru Shisei no To, A Waif of the City, about what it was like in mid-Meiji. Really, Japan was a poor country. The poverty, and also the popular culture, the things that children did in those days. It's like I don't know if you're familiar with the Bowery Boys or Our Gang, that sort of adventures of children, and also growing in adolescence and his thirst for knowledge, and teaching himself and going on to become a leading popular playwright. And the final book is actually a collection of essays called Sugao Kamakura, which translates as the real face of Kamakura, which is an anthology of essays by writers who lived in Kamakura, edited by Osaragi Jiro, who we've spoken about earlier. And there are a number of very, very interesting essays, their takes on the city by people who not only write well, but knew it intimately. And I drew on their essays, in writing my own book. Anyway, these are books that I'm sure listeners have never heard of, but highly recommended.
Thank you. That is wonderful. Thank you so much, Burritt Sabin, for joining us today. You can pick up his books, A Historical Guide to Yokohama, and also Kamakura, A Contemplative Guide, at your favorite bookstore or online.
Okay. Well, thank you, Amy.
You've been listening to the Books on Asia podcast, produced and edited by Amy Chavez and Michael Palmer. Logo by Alex Kerr. Sponsored by Stonebridge Press, publisher of fine books on Asia for over 30 years. They can be found at www.stonebridge.com. And I'm your podcast host, Amy Chavez, author of Amy's Guide to Best Behavior in Japan and The Widow, the Priest, and the Octopus Hunter, Discovering a Lost Way of Life on a Secluded Japanese Island. For more interviews, book reviews, and other features, visit the Books on Asia website at booksonasia.net.